everybody, welcome back to Self-Worth Saturday. Lisa here, welcome back to my channel, Matt as well. It is so much fun doing this series, partly because I'm starting to see in the live chat when these videos premiere, some of the same names coming back again and again, which is pretty awesome. And I'm also starting to see some of the same names showing up in comments, and I really appreciate that we are starting to really build conversations around self-worth. I get super excited about that. So just thank you to everybody who is either watching while this premieres or who is watching this back later. I genuinely appreciate having you be a part of the conversation. Even if you don't feel comfortable commenting or chatting yet and you're just sort of silently watching, I still really appreciate having your energy as part of this whole experience. So thank you so much to everyone who is here. Just as a reminder before we dive into this week's topic, you can expect during Self-Worth Saturday that I will cover a topic related to self-worth. I will give you guys some action steps, we'll kind of dissect it a little bit. I'll share some experiences. I'll give you some action steps. I'll give you some journal prompts so that if you want to do some personal work for yourself, you can. And I'll give us like a collective challenge, something that we can work on for the upcoming week to raise our own personal awareness or perhaps start to change the pattern a little bit for ourselves. And then I do an oracle card reading at the end. And this is my second time filming this because I forgot an oracle deck the first time. But that's what you can expect. This week we're going to be talking about our inner critic and kind of specifically about letting our inner critic drive, like in our minds, like letting our inner critic drive or shoving our inner critic into the back seat so that it's not quite so much at the forefront. Before we dive into this week's topic though, let's talk about last week. So last week we talked about being assertive or standing up for ourselves, standing our ground. And the challenge was to practice being assertive if you felt the need one time in the week. That was sort of the goal. Hopefully over something small and not too like overwhelmingly big. I'm curious if you had an opportunity to be assertive, to hold your ground about something this week. If you did, how did it go? So let us know in the comments or in the live chat if you're in the chat. If you had an experience like that, I'm super curious. For me, I was a little bit cranky this past week. So I don't think I've done an awesome job at not being like passive aggressive or snippy in general. So I don't know that I've done a great job of walking that line between or staying on the assertive side of that assertive aggressive line. Peggy can probably shed some light on it, but I think there's been at least once or twice when I did all right. And typically for me, when I'm being more assertive, it's like I'm stating directly what I need instead of, randomly biting somebody's head off or just being quietly miserable. So I think I did that at least once or twice this week, but yeah, I don't know how great I was at it. I'm curious how you guys did. I'm usually not as great at being at my best when I'm a little bit on the crabby side. And there was no specific reason necessarily besides just random hormones and whatever. But yeah, good times. Yeah, that's how I did last week. So I don't have a ton to share on that point. But I am really curious if anything from last week was helpful, if you guys had a chance to apply it. So definitely let me know down below. I have a stone with me. I usually have something to fidget with when I'm filming because I have a tendency to get off to the races and talk a million miles an hour. This is probably no different, but I tell myself that the stone helps. We'll see. So let's dive into this week's topic. Oh, and one last thing. Just a reminder, I know I keep saying we're going to dive in. Just a reminder, if you have topics you want me to cover, don't forget to comment them in the actual comments of the video after it is like published on my channel. So not while it's live because I might lose it in the live chat, but definitely comment if you have an idea for Self-Worth Saturday, or if you want to drop me an email, that's cool, tarotwithlisa@gmail.com, or you can comment in the Supportive Tarot Facebook group. So definitely want suggestions, but inner critic. So this is actually kind of a big topic. And there's a whole lot of camps on sort of what is the inner critic? Should we be befriending it? Should we be vilifying it and like conquering it? So that is why I came up with the analogy of whether or not we're just going to let the inner critic drive. So let's just define it first. The inner critic is that inner voice that you have in your head that tells you like you're not good enough. It's the part of you that is constantly like maybe not constantly, but it is the part of you that criticizes, that self-berates. It is the voice in your head that literally limits you. It is the source of your self-limiting beliefs. And it comes from this voice that you get, and it's not necessarily a literal voice, but it is the part of you that goes right to self-negativity. And I want to be really clear that I really think all of us have an inner critic. I think some of us have really particularly bossy and loud inner critics, and maybe some of us have less obnoxious inner critics, but I think we all have them. And so really what I want to focus on today is not letting our inner critics do the driving. So if we assume that just getting through our day, getting things accomplished, making headway in our personal growth, making headways in our career, our hobbies, all of that stuff, if that is a literal road we're driving on, we want to be in the driver's seat, we don't want to let our inner critic be in the driver's seat. So I hope that metaphor kind of makes sense because it's what I'm basing this entire video on. So let's hope it works. That said, there is a difference between your inner voice and your inner critic. Your inner voice is that part of you that you can trust. That inner knowing, that intuition, that part of you that knows when something is good for you or not good for you. That inner voice is like your Jiminy Cricket, the one that helps to guide you. Your inner critic is a lying mofo that just likes to pick on you. And there's a big difference between those two inner voices, for lack of a better way to express it. Your inner voice, good. Inner critic, not great. But you can't necessarily, I believe, personal belief, just squash and make your inner critic go away. And I think that if you try to do that, you're setting yourself up for a not great experience. But the inner critic is typically a kind of negative self-talk that leaves us with unpleasant feelings. So our inner critic makes us usually feel ashamed, small, it contributes to us feeling low self-esteem. What else did I write down? Oh, just generally not feeling good enough. So our inner critic like pokes at all of our vulnerabilities that affect our sense of self-worth generally. Yeah, so that's kind of what it looks like. And I think most of us know what our inner critic is, but that's just kind of a general idea for you. Now, what does it look like when you're letting your inner critic do the driving? You might find, if you're letting your inner critic do the driving, that you have a particularly vicious inner critic. You might find that you get really intense self-deprecating thoughts like, you know, I'm ugly, I'm stupid, I'm this, I'm that. How could anyone love me? Like, it's really hard stuff. And if you're getting that a lot, your inner critic may be doing the driving. Your inner critic might be doing the driving if your negative self-talk feels persistent and it feels like that really annoying, terrible song that's just on constant repeat in your head over and over again. That might be your inner critic doing the driving. Your inner critic may be driving if the voice of your inner critic sounds like somebody from your past. And the reason I say that is because when our inner critic sounds like somebody from our past who we perceived as criticizing or judgmental, sometimes there's issues around that relationship with that person and we still kind of got them in our heads, and that can be a sign that we're not making peace, so to speak, with our inner critic, that we're kind of letting it take over. So just food for thought. When our inner critic is in the driver's seat, we let our inner critic stop us, and this is the biggest one. We let it stop us from making progress, whether that is the next step on our path to love, whether that's taking the next step in our career, in our livelihoods, in our hobbies, in our interests. Our inner critic is driving when we let that inner critic determine our behavior, when we let that inner critic create the path that we feel like we have to follow. If our inner critic is driving, we're letting that self-negative talk choose our future for us. Whereas if we're letting our inner voice or our highest self do the driving, we're more likely to take healthy risks. We're more likely to take chances on possibly really, really good things. And we're more likely to try new things just in general. I also think that we're more likely to actually grow and evolve when we're not being sort of butting up against our inner critic who's like trying to drive us far away from what serves us. And I think sometimes we can get our inner critic confused with our conscience or with that inner voice. And I think it's really important to be clear that one of them, our inner voice, our higher self, our inner knowing, our intuition, one of those tells the truth and one of them is a liar. So that's kind of an important perspective, I think, to have. Let's talk about why we struggle with this. So the voice of our inner critic tends to be formed, at least in my opinion, through lots of different life experiences where we have maybe felt like we haven't done well or we haven't met a standard, either our own or somebody else's. It's experience after experience that teaches us to value ourselves less and gives our inner critic's voice more power. When we're struggling with our inner critic sort of driving, it's when we have a tendency to let our inner critic sort of shout us down and paralyze us. And when that happens, it makes addressing the problem in any direct way almost impossible. We struggle with this because we get a lot of mixed messages about our inner critic. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, or at least a little bit ago. I mentioned that there's a lot of mixed messages out in popular like psychology magazines and things like that, articles, blogs. Some people really push the befriend your inner critic model, and some people really push the your inner critic is the enemy, you need to squash it model. And I'm kind of in between those two schools of thought. I think it's important to acknowledge and not ignore your inner critic, because I think that there's information there that's useful for your personal growth. Not that your inner critic has anything useful to say, but that being aware of what your inner critic is saying can teach you about yourself and where you're at on your self-worth path. But that being said, I also think it's important to not see it as a voice that you should listen to, and I think it's important that you stay firmly in the front seat. You can stick your inner critic in the back seat, maybe eventually in the trunk, but definitely don't let your inner critic do the driving if you can help it. So let's talk about maybe how to do that. So let me tell you first a little bit about me and where my inner critic shows up the most. So my core fears are where my inner critic likes to poke at me. So my core fears relate to being unloved or unlovable, unsafe, or at risk of being damaged, usually psychologically, so that kind of unsafe. My fears relate around feeling crazy or broken just because of the different things that I've dealt with throughout my life. And I use those terms because those are the terms that my inner critic uses. Those are not terms I feel are good terms. They are problematic terms. Those are the words my inner critic likes to tell me. My inner critic likes to poke at me about being broken, being damaged, things that are not fixable, and being unworthy and not having a valid voice. So my inner critic loves to shut me up. My inner critic wants me to not be vulnerable, not speak my truth, and to believe that I have nothing worthwhile to say. That's what my inner critic likes to do. Now, I think it's important to pay attention enough to your inner critic that you understand what it's poking at and maybe where your core insecurities are, because that is what our inner critic likes to kind of prey on. And it also highlights areas in your life that might need more of your attention, might need more of your focus to build a little strength in those areas and put you in less of a vulnerable position to your inner critic. It's a way to put yourself back in the driver's seat. That's my experience. But some key sort of ways to approach this, and I have notes, so I'm always looking down, but hopefully it keeps me sort of on track, that and the crystal, we'll see. So here's some things that I think help to put your inner critic, kind of yank it out of the driver's seat and stuff it in the back. Okay, so first, recognize, and this is so important, recognize that your inner critic is not telling the truth. Your inner critic reflects back to you your own insecurities, kind of in the examples I just gave you. That's why it's important to notice what it is your inner critic has been saying. If you can learn to recognize the difference between your inner voice, that inner truth, that inner knowing, and that deep, pure intuition, and your inner critic, it will make a huge, huge difference. And when you're struggling, when you're feeling emotional, when you're feeling hurt or angry, that's when you're most likely to believe your inner critic over that inner knowing. So sometimes all it takes is a few deep breaths to reconnect and go, what is the truth right now? Like, what is true? And that can really, really help. This is number 2, create some space between you and your inner critic. So in meditation, one thing that we talk about a lot, and this is kind of how I formed my belief about how to deal with your inner critic. In meditation, I believe that when we say things like quiet your mind, most people go, what? Because our mind's job is to think. Our mind's job is to constantly be working. When we tell ourselves that to meditate properly, we need to stop our mind from doing its job, we're setting ourselves up for failure. Thoughts are going to happen. That's kind of what the brain does. But in meditation, if you can create space between your thoughts and your consciousness, your awareness, that's where the sweet spot is. When you can pull back and let your thoughts float by like clouds in the sky, like cars on a busy road, when you can witness your thoughts without grabbing onto them and letting them carry you away on a little journey that you didn't really want to be on, when you can create that space and that distance and be the witness to what is happening in your mind, that's where the magic is. And your inner critic is no different. If you can create a little distance and just when you feel those negative self-talk things happening, pull back, be separate from your inner critic in your mind for a moment, just watch those thoughts happen without forming opinions about them, without getting attached to them. Notice them, don't ignore them, but pull back, pull yourself back, kind of zoom out, if that makes sense. It sounds a little bit intangible, but if you can hold that idea of zooming out or pulling back or being the witness in your mind, it will make a big difference in how much weight you give those thoughts in the moment, which I think is really, really important. Number 3, try to notice who you're hearing. Whose voice is your inner critic? Is it yours? Is it your mother's? Your father's? A caregiver? A teacher? An ex-lover? A partner? A friend? Whose voice do you hear? Because this is interesting information that can help you to unpack what's happening and maybe where this voice has come from or what has contributed to it. And that might also help to give you some much needed perspective about it. For example, a word that was weaponized growing up in my childhood was the word selfish. And therefore, one of the things my inner critic loves to do is tell me I'm being selfish. When it's doing that, that's not me. That's my mom. And if I recognize that's my mom when it's happening, and I remember what I've learned about my mom and my relationship with my mom, I can put it in its proper place. Does it always work perfectly? No, but it sometimes helps to give me that much needed perspective. Number 4, replace, and this is so important, this is probably one of the most useful of these tips. Replace the negative self-talk with something positive. It's probably one of the more difficult ones to do, but it's also one of the most effective. If you catch yourself saying something to yourself such as, I'm ugly, force yourself to verbally say, or if you're someplace you can't, to write it down, but do something tangible. Literally make yourself say, I am beautiful. Not, I'm not ugly. I am beautiful. Say the opposite. Write the opposite. And I'm really emphatic about this and really passionate about this because there's a whole rabbit hole we're probably going to go down at some point about patterns. And I've talked about it a little bit on, I think, live chats before about patterns and samskaras and these things that we repeatedly do and how in order to really break those patterns, we need to replace them with new, better patterns. Any habit is like that. Same thing here. If you can replace that negative self-talk with a positive each time you notice it, your inner critic will be in the trunk so fast your head will spin. So I will give you an example from mine. I told you some of the things that my inner critic likes to say. So I'm going to share with you a few power phrases that I use for myself regularly. And lately I've actually been repeating these phrases before bed using my prayer beads. And there are 4 phrases I use that are directly chosen or intentionally chosen. That's the word I wanted. Intentionally chosen because they are the opposite of what my inner critic likes to say. So mine are, I am loved and I am safe. I am calm and full of peace. I am whole and I am unbroken. And this one won't be a surprise. I am worthy and I am unafraid. Now I chose those because each one is directly opposite of what I spent many years believing about myself. And by consciously repeating those words, I give my inner voice more power and I take away some power from that inner critic. Now the last tip, so I have like an itch or a nose or I feel like I'm gonna sneeze. Please don't sneeze. I'm gonna have a sip. I can do this. I might sniff a little. I don't know if that's emotion or if that's just like my nose. I'm sorry. Okay, I can do this. The hardest one, I think, is to practice doing the opposite of what your inner critic tells you to do or to not do. If your inner critic is like, you can never get that raise, you don't deserve it, you're not worth it, and they're never going to pay it to you, then the first thing that you could do to take away power from your inner critic is to march up, consciously put together your plan. But like the idea is that if your inner critic is telling you not to go for the raise, go for the raise. And that's just one example. And it is the hardest one to actually implement. But if your inner critic is trying to paralyze you or prevent you from growing, if your inner critic is like, don't call that guy back, he'll never be interested, make yourself call him back. And yeah, sometimes it's not going to go well. You might not get the raise. The dude might hang up on you. But you're not letting your inner critic do the driving. And I think that that is so, so powerful. All right. That is it for action steps. This is a huge, huge topic. I'm really looking forward to having a live chat with some of you after this video and unpacking this a little bit more. But for now, I'm going to give you a journal prompt, and just one because it's a doozy. So here's the journal prompt should you choose to explore this topic more in writing. Write down some of your most frequent inner critic thoughts. After you've written them down, as many as you can think of, and write them down bluntly. This part is so important. Don't sugarcoat it. Write it how you think it. You can burn it afterwards. You don't have to ever show anybody else. But write it bluntly. And when you're done, at the top of your page, before all the stuff you've written, write "Dear" and fill in the name of somebody you genuinely love, respect, or admire. And this one gives you feelings, okay? So these are all optional. Remember, I am just a tarot reader, yoga teacher, random person on the internet. Use discernment for what feels safe for you to explore. But if you do this and then you read it back, so let's say I were to do this and I were to write down all the things I think about myself, and then I can't even barely say this, and then write "Dear Peggy" at the top and then read it back, wow, would that give me some feelings? Because I would never say those things to her. Why am I saying them to myself? It can be a very, very powerful exercise, but I've kind of spoiled it a little by telling you what step 2 is before you've done step 1. If you can bring yourself to do this, even if you start out with "Dear so-and-so" and still write your words as bluntly as you can, I find it easier to not do that until after I've written them down and then add the "dear." But it can really, really give you perspective about how you're talking to yourself and shake you up a little out of the habit of it. So here is our challenge for this week, as if that wasn't enough. And I'm going to pull out our deck. I'm going to be using the Affirmators deck today because I feel like we need it with this topic. So our challenge this week is to notice when your inner critic starts mouthing off and ask yourself if you are letting your inner critic do the driving or backseat drive, because that's a thing. And if your inner critic seems to be in control, just practice creating a little space between you and your inner critic. Practice being the witness. Just practice separating yourself from that voice a little and watching it without attachment, and just notice your results. And most importantly, just remember that your inner critic is not telling the truth. It never, never is, because it's speaking from our insecurities. So, the oracle card we have this week, or I guess it's an oracle. Ultimate potential is the affirmator card I just pulled. I'll read it to you. I choose to, this is so great. I choose to live a life of my fullest potential. I trust that this will draw me towards experiences and people that support my growth and new accomplishment. Tuning into this frequency, I now reach higher heights than I ever thought possible. Knowing that's an option, why would I have ever tuned into anything else? I'm looking at you, smooth jazz and talk radio. That synchronistic, I got nothing to add, folks. I think that remembering to lean into your potential is so important and helpful, especially when we're talking about our inner critic and the ways that we talk ourselves down from what we could be doing. So with that, I'm going to leave it. I hope to see some of you in the live chat afterwards, but do remember you can watch all of this back and participate in the comments, join in the discussion, share some of your struggles with your inner critic, I can't talk, if you're comfortable. And I look forward to talking to you all again very soon. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye, all.